All right, so before I get started, I want to thank Lourdes Ortega and Rima El Abdali for inviting me to speak and organizing this event. It means a lot to me that so many of you would want to hear me talk about this, and I'm super excited to share with you some of my work today and some of my thoughts about promoting justice through research. So my question today is, can quantitative research contribute to struggles for justice? And as many of you know, I myself often use quantitative tools in my research. So I'll present a fairly optimistic view of that based on my own experience. But before I get into that, I should note that when we ask a question, does research contribute to justice, we cannot provide definitive answers. We can only present arguments. This is similar to the idea of a validity argument, in which a researcher attempts to show that their methods and the conclusions drawn from them are valid by drawing on criteria recognized by members of the field. While this practice is important, we can only offer arguments in favor of the validity of research, and discussions of justice are really no different than that. When we talk about doing research in the pursuit of justice, we are focusing on the effects the research has on the unjust conditions that compelled the researcher to carry out the study in the first place. Notice that I'm saying that the researcher already knows that injustice exists in some way. It's not, the research question is not, does injustice exist in the world? If you want to get into this work to try to argue, for example, that racism is not real, then you are not doing racial justice work, and you should not say that you are. You're also ignoring entire libraries full of research showing you're wrong, but that's really a discussion for another day. If we're serious about having our research contribute to movements for justice, we should not think of justice and injustice in an abstract. Instead, we should be grounded in existing justice movements. It's too easy to slip into vague moral justifications for research, such as the idea that any knowledge could be a tool for someone's liberation. While I acknowledge that this is technically true, it does not present working for justice as something that we can engage in deliberately, but rather just as a possible side effect of our work. My attention here today is how we can deliberately work toward justice. It's also important that the kinds of social changes we imagine and work for are changes that are desired by those who are directly affected by injustice. Researchers have often attempted to intervene in justice issues in ways that do not lead to changes that are desired by those who are impacted by injustice. For example, it seems like every few months, researchers come up with a new technology aimed at deaf people and sign language. For example, gloves that enable sign language to be translated into speech. And the response from deaf people is almost always, we do not want this and we do not need it. This is a clear failure on the part of privileged hearing scholars to listen to those who are immediately impacted by the injustice they aim to remedy, namely deaf people. I want to really quickly make a side note, since I brought up deaf people, and mention that the online formats that we've moved to during the pandemic are not accessible to deaf people. So my talk today, for example, is not accessible to the deaf community, although hopefully they'll get to see it with closed captioning later. But I hope that we will find ways to remedy this as we continue to be socially distanced, because I feel that our deaf colleagues are super important in terms of the insights about multilingualism and communication that they offer. Anyway, moving back to this slide, we need to consider whether, how, and to what extent our research addresses injustice. I think we should be inclusive in how we think about this. There are many ways researchers might spur change, but we should be able to show that the research has done something rather than simply arguing it has vague potential to do it. For example, change might be documented among people who participated in the study. Desired change might also come about as a result of the dissemination of the research, and hence we may have to find examples of how research impacts people that read about it or institutions that tried to take up its findings in order to make an argument that research serves justice ends. There aren't really any easy ways to carry out research for justice ends. There's certainly not a step-by-step guide available, and I'm certainly not going to try to offer one here. And this is a point well made in many of the recent methodological works in our field that try to unpack complex questions about the connections between research and social change. However, much of this work is directed at researchers using qualitative tools. Here, for example, are 3 recent edited volumes from our field, from left to right. The first is Critical Reflections on Research Methods, edited by Doris Warner and Martha Bigelow. Then we have Researching Education for Social Justice in Multilingual Settings, edited by Jean Conte. And the third is Humanizing Research, edited by Django Paris and Maisha Win. Each of these books offers detailed contextualized reflections from researchers who talk about how they navigate the challenges of presenting research that is rigorous, ethical, and serves social justice ends. I want to note that scholars drawing on quantitative research paradigms are largely absent from these volumes. Thus, it feels like we have very little guidance in our field on how to approach quantitative research in ways that are likely to serve justice ends. So my talk today is an attempt to start this conversation in our field, and I hope that we'll be able to continue that in our Q&A session and maybe beyond that as well. My presentation will take the form of a methodological self-reflection, a way of examining research practices and situating them within the complex dilemmas involved in working for justice, such as how to satisfy expectations for rigor while working for justice through our scholarly inquiry. I take inspiration from an article by Abelia Hernandez in which she examines how she and her co-authors applied critical race theory in a quantitative study of higher education. So she writes, the purpose of methodological self-reflection is to examine our own research practices, the factors that influence our practice, and how we can improve it, as well as to grapple with paradigmatic concerns that require attention in order to ensure rigor and appropriate training for the application of quantitative criticalism. So I'll start my reflection by saying a little bit about who I am. And I'll begin by locating myself along dimensions of human difference. This kind of self-disclosure of identity categories is a common practice among qualitative researchers, but it is not something I've seen quantitative researchers engaging in. I focus on my own identity here as a way of pointing out how who I am is connected to how I see the world, and hence the kinds of things I am prepared to understand and to research. I'm a white, cis hetero man. I grew up speaking a variety of English that has enabled me to be perceived as a standard English speaker with all of the privileges that entails. These and other identity categories shape how I was taught to see the world and how I still see the world to this day. Importantly, all of these privileged categories encourage me not to see injustice, since the world we've created is designed to benefit me at the expense of others. The illustration I've included here captures this phenomenon nicely. The white man asks the black woman beside him, "What's the matter?" It's the same distance, ignoring all of the ways in which the race is actually rigged in his favor. As a white man, I've been socialized into this very kind of thing. On the one hand, I've lived my life to a large extent within segregated communities, and thus I'm ignorant of the obstacles facing other people. And on the other hand, I've been taught to respond with dismissal and hostility to any threat to my privilege, including any attempt to draw attention to that privilege. Another aspect of who I am that's kind of contradictory, though, is my politics. I describe myself as a leftist. I began my path toward leftist politics as an adolescent, growing up in the rural Midwest, when my class consciousness was being shaped by my recognition of the socioeconomic inequalities within my rural community, as well as the inequalities between my community and other parts of the United States. I was especially shocked when I first discovered the inequalities between the under-resourced public school that I attended in my small town and the lavish schools that my counterparts living in affluent suburbs were attending. This and other things made me interested in critiquing capitalism. I spent a lot of time sitting in the library reading Karl Marx, for example. Over the years, as I engaged with others in struggles for justice, I was encouraged to unpack my own privilege as a white man, and to think more about how racism is central to creating the very inequalities that I was concerned about. Of course, I continue to grow and develop in my politics all the time. They're not really a static thing, but they certainly affect my scholarship. Today, I'm an applied linguist. I have a PhD in applied linguistics from Georgia State University, and I teach in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University. As a student, I took a few courses in statistics and quantitative methodology. I believed when I began graduate school that I was definitely going to be a quantitative researcher. That did not happen. I don't claim to be an expert in quantitative methods or statistics, but I do claim to have adequate training in these areas to enable me to carry out research using quantitative tools in my area of expertise. As part of this reflection, I began grappling with the question of what makes me different from other applied linguists with similar backgrounds who also use quantitative tools in their work and who are trained in very similar circumstances. And one of the most fundamental differences, I believe, is in our epistemologies. During graduate school, I became dissatisfied with the culture and epistemology of quantitative research in our field and beyond. I found that I did not share the priorities of scholars who exclusively or primarily used quantitative techniques in their research. I was captivated by the brilliant observations made by scholars who explored their topics using qualitative approaches, especially ethnography. As I read this work, I was exposed to different ways of thinking about what it means to know something, or what the best ways to know something might be. These are questions of epistemology, and my epistemology was clearly shifting. I was rejecting the positivism that I was socialized into earlier in life, and was coming to see my views, especially my political views, better captured in critical and interpretive scholarship carried out by qualitative research. So since then, I've published a number of studies, and in them I generally use a variety of different tools. And you can see that they include both qualitative and quantitative techniques. So I have conducted qualitative or ethnographic case studies. I have often used interviewing techniques. I, along with others, have carried out experiments, lab-based experiments. I often use corpus linguistics, and I often combine it with critical discourse analysis. And I've used a number of different statistical analyses of large data sets as well, to try to get into different questions that I have. So in my work, I aim to act in solidarity with marginalized groups, largely by raising awareness of harmful ideologies and critiquing them. To give you a little bit of a sense of what my scholarship looks like, if you're not familiar with it, the publication pictured here is called She Does Have an Accent, But Race and Language Ideology in Students' Evaluations of Mathematics Instructors on RateMyProfessors.com. In this study, I explore the ways in which students rate and comment on their college instructors, especially those whose language marks them as non-native or Asian. And just to give you a sense of the methodological tools that I use in this study, you can see that there's 3 different parts to the study. First, I used Wilcoxon rank sum tests to compare the numeric ratings given to instructors who have last names common in the United States, and compare those to instructors whose last names are common in China and South Korea. Second, I used corpus linguistics tools to examine keywords in the comments about these 2 different groups of instructors, as well as to examine the phraseology within those comments. And finally, I used critical discourse analysis to explore the discursive strategies I saw users drawing on to construct their interlocutors as unintelligible. Here we have another more recent publication. This one I worked on with 3 of my co-authors, Margaret Borovchek, Rachel Thorson-Hernandez, and Francesca Venezia. In it, we aim to explore a recent initiative in language education in the United States called the Seal of Biliteracy. The Seal of Biliteracy aims to provide a credential to high school graduates who can demonstrate that they are bilingual. And we explore how the initiative defines and evaluates bilingualism and what the effects of that are for who will be benefiting from this program. So in this study, we looked at a number of different aspects of the Seal of Biliteracy. We used critical discourse analysis to explore how different actors construct different purposes for the Seal of Biliteracy. So how, for example, comparing, for example, what the advocates, the activists who advocated for the Seal of Biliteracy think its purpose should be versus what governments say it should be. We also used content analysis to explore disparities in testing requirements, specifically with respect to the more stringent requirements for English language proficiency than the requirement, which are more strict than those for other languages. Finally, we used logistic regression to examine how the presence or absence of particular racial groups, students from low-income families or English language learners, would affect the school's decision to participate in the program or not. So what is the connection of all of this to justice? I'm wary of being overly self-congratulatory about my own contributions to struggles for justice, especially as someone with so much privilege. Nonetheless, I do believe that my co-authors and I have managed to make modest contributions to struggles for justice through the use of quantitative tools in our research. I want to put forth an argument here to show ways in which I have observed an impact of this work so that I'm not simply asserting that my work serves justice ends. So the Seal of Biliteracy is perhaps easier to establish an impact on. We were discussing, my co-authors and I were discussing recently made policy, and our work was immediately taken up by activists, politicians, and journalists. We made that research available to one activist group that was lobbying to make their state's Seal of Biliteracy more accessible for students classified as English language learners. They used our work to support their case, and they were ultimately largely successful in getting some concessions from their legislature. There was also media coverage of our study, and I spoke to the Vermont legislature while they were considering implementing the Seal of Biliteracy to let them know about some of the inequities that we had observed in our study. The Rate My Professors study also attracted attention from journalists. For example, I spoke with a reporter from NPR, and I advocated to that person very strongly for viewing communication problems in college classrooms as a two-way street, and to consider the ways that white native English-speaking students contribute to the communication problems that they blame solely on their non-native English-speaking instructors. I also feel that this work has had impact because it is often assigned by faculty teaching undergraduate students about linguistic discrimination, and it gives them a chance to reflect on ways in which they may themselves be carrying out linguistic discrimination. In both cases, I've also heard from many people who said they felt that this work captured their concerns about injustices they had personally experienced. And all of these things make me think that this work has contributed in some small way to struggles for justice. In an article titled "In Defense of Quantitative Methods, Using the Master's Tools to Promote Social Justice," Coakley and Awad argue that quantitative research methods have often been used to perpetuate repression and legitimate prejudice. They argue, however, that the users are to blame, not the tools. That scholars with deep commitments to justice who are interested in contributing to policy discussions will have greater influence if they utilize quantitative methods, but that they will need to challenge the epistemology dominant among quantitative researchers, namely positivism or neopositivism. It's worth pointing out that the attention that my research has often garnered is connected to my use of quantitative tools. Positivism is a hegemonic ideology, and as such, quantitative research is privileged in the sense that it is often seen as more rigorous than qualitative research. I do not support this idea, even though I've benefited from it. I recognize that qualitative researchers have developed their own systems of promoting rigor, and I believe that qualitative scholarship is rich and full of insight, often more so than qualitative scholarship. Because of the centrality of positivism to this discussion, the next part of my talk will unpack what I think of as positivism and explore how we might think differently. Positivism is a contested term. It has a long, complicated history of dispute in the social sciences that goes back decades, perhaps centuries. I'm not qualified to comment on history. It's also a term for critique. Hence, there aren't scholars who self-identify as positivists. But that doesn't mean there aren't people who we can describe as promoting positivist beliefs. For my purposes, I use the term positivism to describe assumptions that the purpose of research is to document empirical facts in a way that is neutral, objective, bias-free, or apolitical. Positivism asserts that using research methods that supposedly remove our subjectivity is the only way to document truths free of the influence of the researcher's bias. This isn't just an isolated belief or statement, though. It describes a whole way of thinking. It channels researchers' energy into trying to remove subjectivity, or more accurately, to remove the evidence of our subjectivity. Positivism's insistence on objectivity has been critiqued repeatedly. Contemporary researchers are much savvier now, including those of us who use quantitative techniques in our research. Most of us are aware that the instruments we use to collect data are themselves potentially biased in any number of ways. We're aware that we influence our participants when we ask them questions in interviews or in surveys. And there are numerous ways that we can come up with that show that researchers can never remove themselves from their subjectivity entirely. But this recognition has not led to a complete rejection of the notion of objectivity amongst quantitative researchers. Rather, we see a new assertion that states that the pursuit of objectivity is itself a virtue in research. I call this neopositivism. But I also believe that neopositivism misses the point, and specifically the point that critical scholars were originally making. So neopositivism encourages us to continue pursuing objectivity because even though we cannot reach it, it's still a good goal. But I argue that that's not really true. It's not simply that objectivity is impossible, but rather that in claiming to be objective, researchers are actually doing something else and engaging in a particular type of politics. They are engaging in a politics that later many others have critiqued as legitimating privilege based on class, race, and gender. And I'll read Patty Lather's, Patty Lather argues, critical scholars reject the idea of scientific neutrality and objectivity, which they argue serve to mystify the inherently ideological nature of research in the human sciences and to legitimate privilege based on class, race, and gender. So to further explore the connection between claims of objectivity and politics, I want to talk a little bit about this popular media bias chart that was made by an organization called Adfonte Media. I've seen it posted a lot on social media by people trying to raise awareness of the credibility of news sites. It's certainly very important that we do so and that we learn to be skeptical about news reporting, as the media do speak from particular positionalities and they do often spread misinformation. That's particularly dangerous at a time like now, when we are facing a deadly pandemic. Oops. However, to me, this chart ends up showing us something very different and something very unintentional. It shows us the conflation of objectivity with centrist politics. The chart couldn't be any clearer on this. The more centrist you are, the more objective you are. How convenient for the Wall Street Journal. But the Wall Street Journal isn't neutral or objective. Centrism isn't neutral or objective. It is a positionality with its own political agenda. Part of that agenda is obfuscating its own political interests and trying to appear bias-free so as to gain authority. So what does this mean for our research? Most of us know that we can't be completely objective, neutral, bias-free, or apolitical. Such a position is impossible. However, I believe if we want to take this idea seriously, we cannot simply let ourselves off the hook and say, well, I'm going to try to be objective anyway. Instead, we need to ask ourselves what our research really does politically. If you acknowledge that your research must be political in some way, then you should be able to say how, and should make that clear to your audience. Once we are aware of our own privileges and political entanglements, it's important that we exercise reflexivity about them in order to increase transparency in our work. Scholars working from qualitative paradigms have long advocated for this, but it has not been taken up by quantitative researchers. In the next part of this talk, I'm going to introduce 3 principles for carrying out quantitative research while being reflexive and working against injustice. I have come up with these principles through reflection on my own research practices, and I'll use my work to try to illustrate these ideas. So here I've listed these principles of justice-oriented quantitative scholarship that I developed. I've relied both on the literature in this area, so for example, that Hernandez article I cited earlier, as well as reflecting on my own. So my first principle is recognizing our privilege. This is especially important for folks like myself, who are privileged in so many ways that are relevant for our work. I, for example, study race and language discrimination, while being a white man who speaks a privileged language variety. It is essential that I recognize that because of my privilege, I often grossly underestimate the seriousness and scale of the kinds of problems I'm looking into. It's only by recognizing this and then taking the next step of finding out what people who actually experience injustice know about it, that I am able to do work that is justice-oriented. The second principle is adopting a critical stance to conventional quantitative research. In particular, I advocate that we view the quantitative researcher's tendency to present themselves as objective and neutral with suspicion. I am suggesting that we ask, what are they hiding when they say they're objective? In order to do this, we will have to closely examine the mathematical and methodological logics that they are employing. The third principle I'll talk about today is quantifying with care. As a scholar who often uses both qualitative and quantitative approaches, I'm going to suggest that having a larger tool set would help quantitative researchers quantify their data in ways that are likely to contribute to struggles for justice. I'm also going to suggest that we recognize when quantification is actually counterproductive and that we look for other ways of exploring our topic when necessary. This is in no way a comprehensive guide to doing this kind of work. I'm really only giving you 3 principles because I don't have much more time than that. So I'll go ahead and illustrate these by drawing on bits of my research, but first I need to give you a little bit of background on the set of studies that I'm talking about here. So one of the topics that I've been particularly interested in is what is sometimes called the ITA, or the International Teaching Assistant problem. I put this phrase in air quotes because it is a common and powerful way of describing communication difficulties in university classrooms, but I find it deeply problematic because it places the blame only on international teaching assistants because of their non-nativeness. So I became aware of this largely as a result of my own teaching and my studying in graduate school with peers who were also international teaching assistants. And one aspect of my teaching and learning experiences in graduate school that I found particularly rewarding was teaching English courses for international students. But that often put me in contact with people who would describe to me problematic communication between themselves and others. In particular, I heard from international teaching assistants who described situations with US students in which I did not feel that the US students were behaving respectfully. Oftentimes, the international students blamed their own English proficiency, but as I listened to these stories, I felt uneasy suggesting that English proficiency could protect them from the way they were being treated by their students. I began reading the applied linguistics literature on communication between ITAs and their students, and I was disappointed to find that in most cases, the applied linguistics literature seemed to be written from the perspective of US-born native English speakers. It seemed to me that the literature was bursting with unacknowledged and unexamined privilege. So my first principle then calls on us to recognize privilege and its effects on how we see the world, and thus its effects on our research. In my own work, I came to believe that my discipline, applied linguistics, was not providing an adequate explanation of communication difficulties between international teaching assistants and their US-born students. And in particular, I felt that the ways in which applied linguists were describing these difficulties was unjustly erasing the contribution of students, the US-born students specifically. Not being an international teaching assistant, though, I didn't have a firm grasp on what was really happening in these situations. I only had a feeling that something was wrong and that something was missing. I turned to a few different sources. First, I read widely. I looked especially for critical scholarship and scholarship using methods that differed from the applied linguistics literature. I also looked for scholarship written by people who were directly affected by the injustice I sensed. A good example of the kind of work that I found influence in is the work of Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, who helped me to connect the ways in which people perceive language to the ways in which we categorize people racially. This is an important insight that has had profound effects on my scholarship. It's also something that is largely absent from the applied linguistics literature on international teaching assistants. I struck up with relationships with people around me who were experiencing the injustice that I sensed. I made space to hear about their experiences, and I listened closely, keeping my privileged impulse to deny injustice in check. Finally, I also conducted ethnographic research. In fact, my dissertation was an ethnographic exploration of these very issues. I did not use any quantitative tools in my dissertation at all. I would recommend all of these things to quantitative researchers interested in contributing to struggles for justice. Read widely, do not let academic disciplines restrict your reading. Engage directly with people who are affected by the injustice that interests you. If you are personally affected by this injustice, your own experience is valuable and you should draw on it. I recommend that quantitative researchers engage in ethnographic research in order to immerse themselves in the complexity of their research topics. My second principle involves reading all literature, but especially the conventional quantitative literature, through a critical lens. Specifically, I mean paying attention to the positivistic tendency to construct researchers, and society more generally as mostly free of bias. We know that it is not possible to be free of bias or to be objective. We need to ask ourselves what the bias is and how it's being hidden and why. In order to do so, we need to think carefully about mathematical and methodological choices in quantitative research. This will require us to understand statistics as well as to understand quantitative research design on a very deep level. So taking a critical eye to the literature could mean a lot of different things. I'm just going to walk you through an example of a conceptual paper that I did with Stephanie Lind, my dissertation advisor. In this article, Stephanie and I discussed the applied linguistics literature on second language pronunciation. In particular, we're interested in how researchers have constructed variables to describe second language speech, such as accentedness and intelligibility and comprehensibility. So one of the kinds of experiments that we looked at while we were writing this paper was an experiment like this. So a typical experiment looked something like this. First, the researchers record second language users of English. Then they play those recordings to first language speakers or native speakers of English. And the native listeners are asked to rate the speech on a scale like what we see here. So how easy to understand did you find the speaker? On one end, we have easy, and on the other hand, we have difficult. So these ratings are averaged across different raters and used to assign a comprehensibility score. In our paper, we make several points that exemplify our critical approach to quantitative research. We argue that in trying to quantify comprehensibility, researchers tend to represent the perception of native listeners as if they were enduring properties of non-native speech. To put this very simply, researchers studying this topic tend to interpret listeners' difficulties in understanding as indicative of a problem with the speech. In our paper, we point out that this is problematic, given that the listener plays as much role in the success of communication as the speaker. Oops. Additionally, we point out that even if listeners rate speech in a reliable fashion, meaning that they all tend to rate it similarly, this may reflect their socialization into hierarchies of speakers, such as the native and non-native speaker binary, and common practices of placing the communicative burden on non-native speakers. This aspect of the situation remains underappreciated in the second language pronunciation literature. So my third principle encourages us to exercise great care in quantifying. Because of the dominance of positivism, we're often encouraged to find ways to quantify our observations about the world in order to have them considered rigorous. I think we need to resist this rush to quantify. The process of taking a complicated situation and boiling it down to a small set of isolated variables so that we can measure the relationships among them is a much more fraught process than you might realize by reading research articles that employ quantitative methods. We must ask ourselves, what do we simplify or erase when we quantify? And we should also ask ourselves whether in doing so, we potentially miss out on aspects of the situation that would help us address injustice. I think we should also recognize that the instruments we use in the process of quantification are imbued with our subjectivity. We need to make sure that we recognize our own privilege when we are designing those instruments and try to find ways to include details that we may not be aware of or see. Similarly, I think we should use qualitative data alongside quantitative data in order to provide greater nuance and to reveal some of the biases in our quantitative instruments. I'm going to walk you through an example of a recent study in which my co-authors and I worked on quantifying the complex decision-making processes that students make when communicating with their international teaching assistants. So the study I'm describing is still awaiting publication. The manuscript is titled Sharing Communicative Responsibility, Training Undergraduates in Cooperative Strategies for Communicating with ITAs Across Linguistic Difference. And my co-authors are Stephanie Lindeman again, and Chris Atchison and Maxiane Campbell. Maxiane has also been a co-author of mine on a number of other studies with this, on this topic too, along with Stephanie. Our goal with this paper is to show that the laboratory-based training exercises that we developed and showed could help native listeners understand non-native speech better could be made into classroom-based activities and made institutionally relevant by embedding them into a department's existing curriculum. We argue that this has justice implications in that it helps respond to a tendency for universities to place the responsibility for ensuring communicative success only on international teaching assistants and other non-native instructors. This kind of training offers a way for universities to encourage those with greater language privilege to address their contributions to communication difficulty. Since one of our goals was to expand these efforts, we sought a way to evaluate our intervention in a way that would be compelling to many different stakeholders, including ones like the faculty of the computer science department, who had been convinced to try our approach when one of my co-authors, Chris Atchison, showed them our previous experimental studies. Our laboratory experiments had been done with a mostly captive audience who we could compel to listen endlessly to non-native speech through offers of extra credit and gift cards. Our new audience were students who could choose to tune out our message if we failed to deliver it in a compelling way. In addition, the module we developed for the computer science department contained a lot more varied information than what our laboratory work did. We expected that the way it would affect students would be different. Indeed, we anticipated that rather than leading to a fine-grained perceptual adaptation like we observed in the lab, we expected a change that was more about attitudes and perhaps future behaviors. I saw an opening to develop a quantitative instrument directly from the ethnographic work that I had previously completed. So the ethnographic work I'm referring to was my dissertation, and you can find it reported in an article titled Students' Orientations to Communication Across Linguistic Difference with International Teaching Assistants at an Internationalizing University in the United States. In this paper, I argue that students have different views about their roles in communication with their ITAs. Some students saw themselves as active participants in classroom communication, and they took a collaborative approach to ensuring that they understood and were understood by their instructors. Other students saw themselves as having been placed in an unfair and unfortunate situation by having to work with an ITA. Specifically, they were given an instructor who they reported they simply couldn't understand. These students tended to report not asking questions directly to the instructor, not seeking out the instructor's help, and relying on other instructors, students, and resources to help them stay on top of the material. Some of them reported avoiding instructors based just on their names. For example, a name that indicates that the instructor is of Asian origin would compel some students to avoid registering for this class. Through this ethnographic work, I was able to begin thinking about how student listeners can make important choices in the classrooms that aid or hinder communication with their ITAs. So in this article, I presented descriptions of behaviors common to different orientations to communication across linguistic difference. And I labeled these collaboration and avoidance, basing those labels off of Stephanie's earlier paper from 2002. The table I present here gives you a couple of different contrasting responses to communication problems. In a situation where the student feels that understanding the instructor is difficult, they reported at least two different approaches. The first was to apply deliberate effort. K2's comments exemplify this. He says, a lot of times you can understand what they're saying. It's just whether you put in the effort to pay attention to them or let the accent distract you. In contrast, C5's comments exemplify avoidance. After a while, like when you realize you can't really understand her, you just kind of zone out. Given a situation where they have not understood something the instructor says, students once again reported different kinds of strategies. Students who were committed to collaboration often chose to repair communication problems through interaction. So E1 says, whether I'm asking for a repeat of what was just said or another classmate, there's always someone who needs to hear the information again. In contrast, those who chose avoidance tended not to engage in repair with their ITAs. F5 says, sometimes when I don't understand something that like my biology ITA FR said, I would just go to the other US-born TA and he would clarify it. I used these observations to design a questionnaire that we could use to quantify students' tendency towards avoidance. Many researchers, including myself, have identified avoidance as a way in which native English speakers use their privilege to avoid doing communicative work and to assign blame to non-native speakers. So the questionnaire that I developed asked students to imagine that they were considering taking a course with Dr. Chen, who was described to them as a computer science professor who spoke English that was influenced by his native Mandarin. The participants then reported how likely they would be to take a number of different actions, such as whether they would register for a course with him. We asked the participants to take a 12-item questionnaire once before we worked with them and then once afterwards, so a pre-test and a post-test design. They rated their willingness to do each action on a 5-point scale, and we analyzed each with non-parametric tests using a Bonferroni adjustment to keep the experiment-wide alpha level at 0.05. Ultimately, what I was able to develop was an ethnographically informed questionnaire that we could use to get a sense of how committed to collaboration the students we were working with were before and after they participated in our program. So one of the findings from our study was that the intervention seemed to encourage students to change some of their behaviors. So here we see that there was an increase in students' reported willingness to raise their hand to ask Dr. Chen for clarification if they didn't understand something in his lecture. The Wilcoxon-signed rank test showed that the difference between the pre and post test was significant, and we interpret this as a positive sign that our intervention was encouraging students to be more collaborative in their communication with their international instructors. Even though we collected this numeric data, I think it would be a mistake to simply rely on a quantitative measure like this. So we also collected other forms of data that were more qualitative, and we triangulated our quantitative findings with this qualitative data. Here I've given you a couple of excerpts from students talking about how they would approach a situation where they didn't understand something their instructor said, a situation very similar to the one we posed in our Likert scale items. This time we collected extended textual responses, and these responses helped us see that there's more going on than what our quantitative data suggests. When asked how they would respond if they didn't understand something in a lecture, one student wrote, "You ask a question, dummy." Another student wrote, "Ask for clarification, or simply explain that you were finding it hard to understand him. He should not get offended because he must be aware of his own accent. As a result, he could explain the material once more, paying closer attention to his pronunciation and possibly speaking slower, thus solving the problem." We argue that these responses do show a willingness to ask questions, but also seem to suggest naivete about the social dynamics of doing something like raising your hand and asking a question of a non-native speaker instructor. For example, neither response shows sensitivity to the fact that many international instructors are very anxious about the way their language is perceived by others. This helps us tell a more nuanced story about how a training like ours might have some positive benefits, but we should not be too quick to think of this as a total solution. While this may contribute to justice, there's definitely more work to be done. So to wrap up my talk here, I do think quantitative researchers can make contributions to justice movements. Indeed, because of the disproportionate influence that our methodology has with people in power, we can often make very important contributions that are heard that garner a much larger audience. Nonetheless, there are obstacles to this, and one of the biggest is the hegemony of neopositivism among quantitative researchers. Neopositivism is the view that research should be objective, neutral, unbiased, or apolitical, and I argue that as an ideology, it functions not to make our research be objective or neutral, or unbiased, or apolitical, but rather to encourage us to ignore and obfuscate the ways in which our research is political. I've made 3 recommendations for how to deal with this. The first is for privileged scholars to immerse themselves in the realities of the injustice they wish to intervene in, particularly because their privilege prevents them from knowing or seeing the full extent of the injustice. Second, I suggest that we read positivistic scholarship critically. We should ask what the tendency to try to appear unbiased leaves out and why. Finally, I've suggested that we exercise greater caution with the choice to quantify. Indeed, I think we should think of it as a choice rather than seeing the need for quantification as a basic prerequisite for rigor in research. I would argue that unnecessary and spurious quantification actually reduces the rigor of research. We would be much better off with nuanced discussions of qualitative forms of data. Here are some of my references, and here's the rest. And I wanted to also thank Lourdes and Rima once again for their help in organizing this. Thank you.